This presentation is about a documentary film called Inside Job. My name is Wendy Rios, and I'm the Corporate Outreach Strategist for Graduate Programs and the Scholarship Administrator and Events Coordinator for McCoy College of Business. I received my undergraduate degree from Southwest Texas State University, and I'm currently pursuing a Master's of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies in Organization, Workforce, and Leadership Studies. This presentation is an assignment given in Strategic Management and Organizational Dynamics, OCED 5361, Dr. Carrie Bowden. The presentation will bridge the gap between the theories and the real world using complex adaptive human systems and complex responsive processes. For 6 weeks, I have actively engaged with classmates through discussions, storytelling, and intense reading to help me better understand the complex terms about strategic management and organizational dynamics. The assignments and my classmates have helped me link the studies to my everyday life. In reading all 18 chapters of the textbook, we were required to capture our understanding with 3 original online posts and 3 replies to classmates. These were very helpful in giving me another point of view from another discipline. Additional assignments to help me grasp an understanding was a group book club report and a 35 to 5,000 word paper incorporating complexity science and systems theory. Inside Job shows the history of the financial industry and the events leading up to and after 2008. The documentary film shows a comprehensive analysis of the events of the investment banking history from the 1980s through 2010. The film opens in Iceland, narrated by Matt Damon. Other locations included the United States, England, France, Singapore, and China. The film refers to the 40 years of growth our country has experienced since the Great Depression. The story tells of how investment banks were once small, private partnerships investing and selling stocks and bonds. The film shows extensive interviews with financial insiders, politicians, journalists, and academia from prestigious universities. The narrator talks about the success of the most prominent investment banks, Bear Stearns, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and Lehman Brothers. It goes on to discuss the global credit rating industry to signify how creditworthy a company is, with the highest level exhibiting the least risky companies and the least likely to default. The 3 prominent agencies that control financial ratings are Moody's, Standard & Poor, and Fitch. Letters are used to rate, with AAA being the highest. The higher the rating, the lower the cost of borrowing for the issuer. Higher ratings for companies allow them to be seen as stable and able to borrow more money, increasing their market shares. When companies employ conservative investors, they will typically sacrifice yield return to remain at a high rating. High ratings allow deregulation in financial institutions the leverage of risking more. This chart shows the ratings between the 3 rating agencies previously mentioned. Although Moody rates on a slightly different means, the rating grade description remains the same across the board. The changes in the policy environment and banking practices shaped the financial industry. The film was acclaimed by film critics for the exposition of so much complex material. The financial industry was regulated from 1941 to 1981. In the 1980s, a savings and loan crisis cost the taxpayers approximately $124 billion. In the late 1990s, the financial sector consolidated into several giant firms. And in 2000, the internet stock bubble burst because firms bet on internet companies failing, and it resulted in a $5 trillion investment loss. When derivatives became the next financial bet, although thwarted by legislation, key officials changed the rules. The industry was dominated by investment banks such as Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, and Bear Stearns, 2 financial conglomerates, Citigroup and J.P. Morgan, and 3 securitized insurance companies, AIG, MBIA, and AMBAC, and 3 rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor, and Fitch. Investment banks bundled with mortgages and other debts to create collateralized debt obligations, CDOs. These CDOs were rated as AAA ratings, and loans were handed out to homeowners. Between 2001 and 2007 and the housing boom, investment banks began purchasing credit default swaps, or CDSs, which acted like an insurance policy, but on things that they didn't own. Goldman Sachs sold more than $3 billion in CDOs and continued to bet on those of low value. The rating agencies continued to give high ratings. Warnings of the possibilities of trouble were given by the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, who identified the risks of what was happening. The U.S. Treasurer at the time, Larry Summers, called the warnings misguided. In the application of theories and concepts, we first visit complex adaptive systems and the system agents. In the film, these were seen as the investment banks, insurance companies, board of directors, mortgage companies, U.S. representatives, Secretary of Treasurer, Presidents of the United States, lobbyists, prime ministers, managing editors, and business schools. The individuals included CEOs, COOs, CFOs, chairmen, accountants, senior management, investors, professors, and deans. The depositors or homeowners were never consulted on the actions of those above that use consumer funds to continue to build financial wealth. In continuing with complex adaptive systems, we look at self-organization, rules that evolved, and the way of emergence. The financial institutions worked with each other and the government to continue conducting business as usual. The investment banks dominated the industry and were rated by agencies as strong and solvent. Government appointees with ties to the financial industry made decisions that benefited the institutions and themselves. The emergence appeared as the destruction of companies, but not the creation of regulation. The amplification was continual, significant, huge changes. In looking at complex responsive processes, we look at the organizational knowledge shared, the conversations that raised the potential for change, conflicting restraints, and the dynamics of inclusion or exclusion. Governments allowed deregulation of financial institutions. The investment banks were making lots of money, no matter their political affiliation. Legislation allowed large companies to merge, and bets were hedged, knowing the risk of failure was huge. Advisors were paid for consulting, and government positions appointed by the CEOs of companies that worked for the investment banks. The largest financial institutions worked with other large financial institutions to allow each to continue making money however they needed. Exclusion happened by not allowing their actions to be changed. In continuing on complex responsive processes, we look at the facilitators or the inhibitors' change, how they evolve, and the implications of understanding the evolutionary process to achieve a more sustainable level of performance. Governments allowed deregulation of financial institutions. Not securing the actions of investment banks and giving them the ability to borrow as much money as they wanted allowed for the system to continue to be unstable. Investment banks were making lots of money. The more money borrowed, the more unstable the system became. The more money the facilitators made and the less they were held accountable, the more their actions were geared toward their own needs and not those who would be most affected. Legislation allowed large companies to merge. Bets were hedged, knowing the risk of failure was huge. Billions of dollars were lost, millions of jobs were lost, and millions of homes were lost. The story told in The Inside Job shows a worldwide economic crisis. The countries affected were Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom. The collection of fraudulent activity could be seen in all those we trusted: investment banks, government, politicians, and insurance companies. This slide shows many of the people that were involved in the 2008 financial meltdown. Many were left fearful, broke, with no job, and didn't know where to go. While the world was trying to figure out what to do from the 2008 financial crisis, those responsible for the companies of Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Bear Stearns, and J.P. Morgan walked away unscathed, unaccounted for, and left with their billions and their lavish lifestyles. The 2008 financial crisis is one of the most blatant displays of injustice on all people who work hard to provide a decent life for their families. I do not take exception to anyone that makes a lot of money. My disgust is to the people who trample on others along the way. The greed displayed by the financial executives portrayed in Inside Job is astoundingly almost unbelievable. That there was never a hard stop to the fraud that was allowed, not by one company and a few people, but by institutions that were large conglomerates that could be devastating to the economy should they fail. The few whistleblowers who tried were halted in their tracks, not only by the executives in the public sector, but by government workers that currently entrusted with their lives. When these financial institutions continued to risk consumer money for their gain is unfathomable. When these institutions failed, the government bailed them out, and these executives didn't lose anything. The same was not afforded consumers who lost everything. How is that possible? People who had no way to recover from their losses is heartbreaking. There was no accountability to any investor in their roles. These investors had the ability to stop the crisis before it happened. The executives in the investment banks, financial banks, insurance companies, and rating agencies were all able to walk away with billions of dollars and continue their lavish lifestyles. We should be more diligent in watching the people who speak for us in our lives. We need to be better in asking questions and getting answers. We vote for these leaders to manage our lives. Corruption must not be allowed to happen. I believe the fear of going up against people with power and money cripple our efforts to be heard. The 2008 financial crisis cost more than $20 trillion. That is the price for corrosive relationships, corrosive politics, deregulation, and conflicts of interest in paying academia for their opinion. The scales of justice represent impartiality and the obligation of the law, through its representatives, to weigh the evidence presented.